Hey there, it's Tom Jordan, and Inauguration Day, about a month and a half away? And the question comes up, do we think that the world is going to become much more dangerous or much safer under the incoming president, Donald Trump? Trump has a dramatically different approach than Joe Biden does to foreign policy. I think it's become obvious to most people watching these kinds of things. And with wars being waged, with U.S. involvement under the Biden administration in Europe and the Middle East, and growing threats over in Asia as well. So Donald Trump's likely approach to foreign policy with Ukraine and Iran, with China, with Israel, Gaza, and the Middle East in general is rooted in his past actions and his declared intentions. He wants the wars to stop. But are we too far gone? And can we do this in an efficient and a successful manner? I'm going to get into this in a few seconds with my guest today, Dr. Paul Rahe, professor of history at Hillsdale College. That's just seconds away. Also, just a reminder to chime in. We'd like to get your comments, your questions as well. You can ask Dr. Rahe. You can ask me these questions. We'll get them up here and answered for you in the comments section of YouTube, on X, on Facebook, wherever you're watching. Remember, the podcasts live on Spotify and Apple Podcasts as well. And I will get to those in just a moment. Chime in. Love to hear from you. Also, a reminder, the best way you can help Tom Jordan Live, help us out, is simply subscribe. It's free. Subscribe to the podcast. Click that notification bell. We'll alert you of new content that comes down the pike. And if you can share them as well, that's fantastic. All right, let's get into this. So Israel, Gaza, the Middle East. It's just the tensions have just flared up ever since October 7th of 2023, the terrorist attack on Israel. So you got Hamas now, you got Hezbollah, you've got the Houthis, you got all these things, and all funded by Iran, right? So Donald Trump has come in, and his history is this, that he has incredibly strong support for the nation, the state of Israel. And he's emphasized that unwavering support for Israel, viewing it as a cherished ally, as we have historically here in the United States. And he recognized Jerusalem, if you remember, as Israel's capital, which other presidents has refused to move the U.S. embassy there. He did so back in 2017. And a major symbolic shift that signals robust support for Israeli sovereignty in that region. And his administration, remember this, also recognized Israeli control over the Golan Heights in 2019. I think they nicknamed it like the Trump Heights or something like that. They love him in Israel. They do, because they know he's staunchly supportive of that nation. And then there were the Abraham Accords as well. Trump brokered these normalization deals between Israel and several Arab nations, and it fostered regional alliances that nobody thought could really come to pass. They did. But there's the Palestinian conflict as well. And Donald Trump, you look at him, he rejects this two-state solution. By the way, I think most Palestinians do as well. And most Israelis over there reject it too. It's just us here in the United States that seems to think this is somehow a plausible resolution, which we've never seen it really garner the support in the regions that matter to support such a two-state solution. But he has proposed a peace plan that would grant Israel significant control over these disputed territories, and proudly standing with Israel. So we're going to get into that. We're going to get into his stance against Iran, pulling out of that nuclear deal that was highly ineffective back in 2018. It was controversial, but he does see Iran as a principal threat, not only to Israel, but also to the United States. It is a leading sponsor of terrorism, the biggest sponsor of terrorism in the world. So he's in Saudi Arabia, of course, doesn't like Iran either. So it was good in that sense that Donald Trump normalized relations, tried to at least, with Saudi Arabia. And I don't think that's gone over so well since Biden took over. So we're going to deal with that. We're going to talk about Russia and Ukraine, ending the war in Ukraine. Donald Trump says he can negotiate a pretty swift end to the war, but has not really outlined any specific terms on how he would do that. His relations with Russia, the media will go out there and they'll say that he's a friend of this guy, Vladimir Putin, when in all actuality, his presidency, his relation with Russia and Vladimir Putin specifically, there might have been some public warmth there, but it was contrasted with the expanded sanctions against Moscow for the aggression that they were threatening and that they'd already committed in Ukraine and the election interference. He was very strong, and he got out of these very significant arms control agreements with Russia, like the INF Treaty, that was one, and the Open Skies Treaty. So we're going to get into these kinds of things too. What does it look like in Ukraine and in Russia with Donald Trump in office? And then there's this country.
Let's say China. 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 I love them. China.
Yeah, China. That's a big threat too, and we're not talking about just the threat of war with China in Taiwan, but also the trade and economic policies the United States has with China, and he does view China as the principal economic rival to the United States, and rightfully so, it seems. And implementing tariffs, what does that look like? Pushing for fair trade agreements during his presidency were highly controversial. There's national security concerns and the stealing of intellectual property. And anyway, we might tap into that aspect of this, foreign policy perspective from Donald Trump as well. Who are we going to do that with? Well, an expert. Of course, that's who we get here in the program, Tom Jordan Live. Dr. Paul Rahe is professor of history at Hillsdale College, and Dr. Rahe joins me now here on Tom Jordan Live. Doctor, it is so nice to have you. It's a real privilege. I appreciate your time.
It's a pleasure to join you.
Thank you so much. So I guess I'll start off with just kind of a general sense that you have, the far different strategy, it seems, that Donald Trump has compared to the current administration under Joe Biden as it relates to foreign policy. Do you think overall this is going to make our world safer, our country safer, or might it inflame some of these tensions that are happening overseas?
I don't think it'll make us less safe. Will it make us more safe? I'm not entirely sure, but let me put it this way. American policy since the end of the Cold War has been what I call an improvident stewardship. That is to say, for 30 or more years, from about 1990 on, we sought an arrangement with Iran. We built up Russia economically. We built up China economically. One of the things we did is we encouraged American businesses to be involved, and they made terrific profits for a number of years. And partly what they did is they exchanged American technology for huge payments. And what we did is we created rivals for ourselves. We were foolish. We thought that you could draw Russia and draw China, and ultimately we also thought you could draw Iran into the sort of political order and economic order that we had begun building at the end of World War II and were extending to the whole world, the rules-based order. And what did we do? We helped create revisionary powers who wanted to overthrow that order. They don't really have a lot in common except their dislike of us. So you have a kind of alliance between Russia and China, and they are allied with the Islamist regime in Iran. What they have in common is their enemy and what they want to overthrow. There's a lot they don't have in common. Let me give you one concrete example.
Yes.
In 1969, and very few people have paid any attention to this, Russia and China fought a war. They fought a war along their border. And what lies behind that war is Siberia was ceded by China to Russia in the 19th century by dint of what the Chinese today call an unequal treaty. Same kind of treaty that led to their ceding of Taiwan to Japan towards the end of the 19th century. And the current Chinese regime, going all the way back to Mao, is dedicated to overturning what they call these unequal treaties. So if you look out in the world and you ask who has a claim on territory occupied by Russia, there are two such countries: Japan, and that has to do with some islands in the Pacific, very small, doesn't amount to much of anything, and China, which
Hmm.
has a claim on all of Siberia.
So
So
they
the
have a long
real
memory.
threat,
It,
yeah,
yeah.
the real threat to Russia is China. But what you have is a group of people in charge in Russia today who are obsessed with traditional Russian imperial goals in Europe.
So they
So
kind of
that,
have a similar philosophy, it seems, because you might make the case that okay, well, Russia is claiming that Ukraine, just like China views Siberia and maybe Taiwan, that Russia views Ukraine as part of their territory as well, and they don't forget these things, and it seems like over time, eventually, these ugly heads, I guess, rear themselves, and we're drawn back into these conflicts. But I want to go back to the first point you were making. You're basically saying that the United States was very foolish in the fact that we help prop them up, we help give them the power in the finances, the economy, as we're trying to boost them up to try to make them more democratic, I guess, is what we're trying to do, more successful in their own right. But what that ended up doing is they turned around and started biting the hand that feeds them, so to speak. So we ended up hurting ourselves by trying to help them out in the first place. Is that kind of what you're arguing here?
absolutely.
Hmm.
And this happened under Republican and Democratic administrations alike. It begins with the elder Bush, it continues under Clinton, the younger Bush, Obama. The only person to have broken with this and to have said what we have been doing does not work is Trump.
Hmm. So
And
he's
when he
got a lot
became
of people
president,
against him in that. So
oh,
why is
yes.
he so alone in that? I guess recognition. And he's not necessarily alone because you understand and you recognize what he's been able to identify as a real threat by our involvement. And but now there's a real push towards, well, he's a nationalist, he's not a globalist, and that's a danger to democracy somehow. But really, what he's saying, no, we want to protect our country, but from these obvious foreign enemies. I mean, can you describe what the claim is against Donald Trump, that he's a nationalist and therefore that's a dangerous ideology to have in this country?
Well, his opponents, and this includes the Bush family,
Hmm.
are Wilsonians. That is to say, they have embraced a kind of utopian vision of what the world can be like. They're not 100% wrong. Commerce does make war less likely sometimes. And our post World War II policy vis a vis France and Germany put an end to the competition, the rivalry between France and Germany that helped give rise to two world wars. But there was a presumption this could be done worldwide, which required that you ignore Russian history and ignore Chinese history. In the case of Germany, think what we had to do to Germany to end the German imperial project. Um, we didn't do that to Russia in the Cold War. It was not done to China.
Hmm.
So there was a kind of foolish optimism, and all sorts of people invested in it, including the American business community, people
Hmm.
in universities. It is the dream of globalization.
Yeah.
Uh, and along comes Trump, and he says, this doesn't work. He's a little bit like Winston Churchill in 1938 when he gave the Munich speech.
Hmm.
Very unpopular,
Hmm.
very unpopular in his own party,
Hmm.
because what he is saying is something extremely unpleasant for these people to hear because they're all invested in this.
Yeah.
So when his White House, I think H.R. McMaster was his foreign
Yeah.
policy advisor at that time, declared Russia and China rivals rather than mere competitors. Now, rivals, that means there's something serious here. there was an eruption against him. Uh, that's now sort of accepted, but what what it requires to treat them as rivals, if we're going to be serious about it, we've not yet done. Uh, I don't believe Trump was a very effective president first time around. He was an amateur coming to Washington. His appointments were, on the whole, not very good. I think he's learned a lot since then, and we'll see how well he does this time. But his orientation is different. So and you're right. I do not think he is turning his back on,
Yeah.
say, Europe. What he is saying to the Europeans is no more free ride.
Yes.
They have been
So,
free
and that's
riders on
yes, they have. And that's what a
on
lot of
a,
people don't understand. I mean, we are, obligated. There's the Budapest Memorandum that we are obligated as a country
yeah.
to support Ukraine in this because they gave up their nukes in exchange for us protecting them in case Russia came back and against them. So we have that obligation, but that's an obligation that's supposed to be borne out by NATO, all these countries that are working together. Donald Trump is putting the pressure on all of NATO to do more of their quote unquote fair share to fight against this threat, and we've been kind of leading the charge, at least economically, on this. And he's gotten pushback on that. But can you explain the importance of really Europe and the majority of NATO there engaging in a more effective manner to quell this threat from Russia going into Ukraine?
Well, the problem arises from the fact that the European countries committed to spending a certain proportion, usually around 2% of their GDP, on defense, but they didn't do it.
Hmm.
Now, there are exceptions to this. The Baltic states, which recognized from the beginning what a threat Russia could be. Poland. Poland is now spending 4% of GDP on its military. Uh, the worst of the countries in Europe was the richest of the countries in Europe, that is Germany.
Hmm.
Uh, they made themselves dependent on cheap natural gas from Russia so they could call themselves clean in terms of not fracking and not contributing directly to supposed global warming.
Yeah.
It allowed them to do their little virtuous dance, but the price was their dependence on Russia. And of course, what's happened since the outbreak of the war in Ukraine is Germany is the slowest growing economy in Europe as a consequence of foolishness on their part over a very long period of time.
Yeah.
Uh, so what Trump did is he said, if you're not willing to defend yourself, we're not going to do it. And he's absolutely right. And by the way, every American president in recent times has pressed the Europeans to invest in their own defense. And the European response was essentially, we are better than that. We know that everything can be negotiated. You Americans believe only in force.
Hmm.
Uh, the
Right.
the uh, the Russian invasion of Ukraine was a wake up call for the Europeans,
Yeah.
and you
It's
can see
ironic
it.
because it's
Sweden
the
joining NATO, Finland
yes,
joining NATO.
yes,
Uh, yeah, it's
right.
astonishing. Uh,
It's we Americans that only believe in force, and yet Russia has been that major threat of force ever since the fall of the Soviet Union directly on Europe. And that's why we, as Americans, the United States government officially, promising to help defend those very countries from the threat that was posed by Russia at that point. He's Donald Trump has said that he can resolve this pretty quickly. He used to say, "I can do it in a day. I can stop this war between Russia and Ukraine." Is there any realism to that, or is it going to take longer than that, or what do you think he needs to do to resolve this particular conflict?
it's hard to know. Donald Trump is a boaster. Um, he also is a man who believes in his capacity to do deals because he's had a lot of experience with this. If you remember, during his first administration, he tried to do a deal with North Korea. It
Yes.
didn't quite work. He has confidence that he can do a deal with Putin. and we'll see. But in this connection, let me say one thing. 2 years ago, I found myself at a dinner in Washington, D.C., held by a little foundation that I was chairman of the board at the time. And I ended up sitting next to a prominent New York Times columnist, their senior columnist, whose
Mm.
name I cannot mention to you. Uh, uh, and she asked a question of the speaker, calling him by his first name. Uh, do you think that Vladimir Putin would have gone into Ukraine if Donald Trump had been president? Now, the person asking this question hates Donald Trump.
Yes.
Um, and the answer given by the speaker, who also works at the New York Times, was Russian collusion and so forth, all that nonsense.
Hmm.
I leaned over to this woman who was sitting next to me and I said, "You think otherwise, don't you?" And she nodded her head. Putin
Really?
wouldn't have gone in, wouldn't
Hmm.
have gone in if Trump had been president. And I then said to her, "It's Nixon, isn't it?" And she looked at me and she says, "That's it. That's exactly right." Now,
Hmm.
what does that mean?
Yeah, what does that mean?
Uh, okay, Donald Trump had a little bit of trouble with Iran, and there were some attacks, missile attacks, on American troops in Iraq by Iranian clients. They had been arranged by a man named Soleimani, who was head of the
Hmm.
Al-Quds force.
Yeah.
Trump ordered his assassination,
Hmm.
a shocking act, an undiplomatic act.
Hmm.
Okay, it created a situation where the attitude of a guy like Putin, it was, you don't know what this guy's going to do, this Donald Trump. He's
Yeah.
just crazy. Okay, that's Nixon.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah.
uh, and um, why did he go in under Biden? Biden was the heir of Obama, and Obama allowed Putin to get away with the first invasion of Ukraine, the seizure of Crimea and the seizure of those provinces along the Russian border. That's the first thing. The second thing is the American pullout from Afghanistan. And let me say, I think we should never have sent troops in long term to Afghanistan. The American pullout under Biden was a disaster and a deep embarrassment, poorly organized, a real horror. So it was the view of Vladimir Putin that Biden wasn't going to do anything. He was weak. And I believe Putin was right because I think what caused the United States to weigh in defense of Ukraine were two things. One, the Ukrainians used Javelin missiles to knock out the invading Russian tanks. And there was a paratroop operation, and they killed all of them. They were prepared for the Russian invasion, and they handled it. But the second thing is Biden offered Zelensky an exit, that the Americans would get him out. And he publicly said, "I don't need a ride. I need ammunition."
Yeah, I remember that.
Okay,
Which
with the
actually, to
midterms
me,
coming
made
up,
Biden look even weaker on the world stage, and it propped up Zelensky to make him seem strong and tough, and he's going to fight back this Russian invasion that, by all intents and purposes and objective, I guess, the optics are what Joe Biden had allowed in the first place. To allow them to
right,
come in. I think you're absolutely right. I think that you could. So go back to Soleimani and what Donald Trump did. He took him out, and Iran, of course, is still promising revenge based on that assassination. But what it did, I mean, in your view, don't you think that it made the world safer from these dictators and these authoritarians who wanted to invade other countries to get back their land that they thought was theirs?
oh, it had a very positive effect. And it also caused, in my view, and in the view of this New York Times columnist, the Russians to think twice about doing something like an invasion of Ukraine. Uh, because uh, Trump might actually do something. And the expectation was Biden would do nothing, and I think it was his intention to do nothing. And Zelensky embarrassed him. I don't need a ride, I need ammunition. And with the midterms coming up, Biden thought, I don't have any choice. I've got to back these people.
Hmm.
And what he has done ever since is back them half heartedly, not providing them with what they needed the most at the time that they needed it. For example, in that first year, when the Ukrainians had the advantage because the Russian invasion had not fully succeeded, and when the Ukrainians took back a fair amount of territory that the Russians had seized, uh, if we had given them the kind of artillery that they needed to hit the Russians behind their lines logistically, there might have been a collapse of the Russian front. The Ukrainians might have swept everything. So
Was it
what's
ever
go-
realistic? Because Joe Biden's claim was that, well, if we do that, they got nukes, and we'll probably enter World War III if we go into that level, to that degree, to fight back the Russian troops. Would you think that would have ever happened?
No, no. Look, a nuclear war would be the end of Russia.
Yes.
So those weapons aren't going to be used. They're going to threaten it, but they're not going to do it. Uh, and bit by bit, we have given the Ukrainians the things we denied them that first year. So this war in Ukraine reminds me of Vietnam, gradual escalation aimed at getting negotiations. It didn't work well in Vietnam. It has not worked well in Ukraine. So, what can Donald Trump bring to bear on this? Well, he's got leverage over Zelensky. And what he can say to Putin is, we're going to give them everything they need really to hurt you. And you've got to understand, the Russians are hurting now. The ruble has collapsed. The cost of living has gone through the ceiling. They're having trouble supplying troops at the front. They're bringing in North Koreans. They're paying Yemenis and all sorts of people because they don't dare draft the great Russians who live in the area of Moscow. In other words, this is a war that has been fought by people from the Russian periphery, the minorities, people in the poorest parts of the country. They're not drafting people in Moscow or near Moscow or Petersburg. You can go down the list of things that they haven't done, and they don't dare do, because the popularity of the war will plummet if the body bags begin to come back to Moscow. So they're in real trouble. And we're in a situation where we could up the ante. Now, there is a larger question. Is a ceasefire in our long-term interest? Because a ceasefire may simply be an opportunity for the Russians to pull themselves together, to build more weapons, and to try another time. So this is a tricky business.
It is, but if you combine it with more sanctions, maybe they don't have the funding to rebuild the weapons in their military, and it's. I know it's very, very complicated. I like the idea of ramping up our leverage, against Putin. And Donald Trump said, I think when he was in his office, he told Vladimir Putin, because he says they never would have invaded with me there, because I told Putin himself, if you ever go into Ukraine, I'm going to attack the Kremlin, directly. We're going to blow up those little beautiful spirals, whatever you call them, back then. And sure enough, Putin, of course, was never going to attack Ukraine because he knows, as you said earlier, that Donald Trump would probably follow through on that threat based on what he did with Soleimani. So hopefully that's just one of several conflicts that the United States is engaged in to some degree. You look at the Middle East, and you brought up Iran, and Iran under Joe Biden has been able to reap in tens of billions of dollars to, rebuild its military, rebuild its efforts to fund these proxies like Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis, and sure enough, that's what they have done. What's Donald Trump's approach to Iran, who is directly funding what's happening in Gaza and Israel and such.
Well, if we were to judge by what he did last time, he'll come down on them economically by enforcing the sanctions heavily, uh, and he will back the Israelis in Gaza in a pretty serious way. And that involves providing weapons because they've been fighting for a long time. They've used an awful lot of their stocks. The same thing against Hezbollah. And as for the Houthis, we got to be able to do that ourselves or with the help of the Egyptians. Remember, the Houthi business is an attempt to close the Red Sea
Hmm.
and to close the Suez Canal. So, what are the Iranians doing? They're conducting an economic war against Egypt, and the economy in Egypt is heavily dependent on the income from the Suez Canal. And the Red Sea is a sort of no-go zone as a consequence of what the Houthis have been doing. It shouldn't be that hard to knock them out. The
What do the
Biden
Houthis
administration,
gain by doing that? What's their motive in closing down the Red Sea? I mean, it's a huge, it's a huge place of commerce, and the ships that are coming back and forth through that major area. What do they gain by shutting it down?
well, if you're thinking of gains of a material sort, the answer is nothing. If you're thinking of it from a religious perspective, the Houthis, like the Iranians, those who control the regime, like Hezbollah, they're all Shiites.
Hmm.
And so, from their perspective, this is a war against the Sunnis. This is something that goes way back in Muslim history uh, and is taken quite seriously by both the Shiites and the Sunnis. So, if you want to ask what allowed the Abraham Accords,
Mm.
the answer is the Iranian threat.
Hmm.
Uh, the Sunni states of the Gulf, not fully including Saudi Arabia, though tacitly including Saudi Arabia, made essentially an alliance with the Israelis against the Iranians. So, for all of their anti Israeli rhetoric, they hate the Shiites more than they hate the Israelis.
Yes. And with the rise of the power of Iran, the Shia nation, and then the Sunnis, like Saudi Arabia is primarily a Sunni nation.
Yeah.
They're willing to get. Do you think they will, with Donald Trump coming back to office, that the Saudis will now enter into this pact with the United States and Israel and the other nations within the Abraham Accords in order to help fend off this Iranian threat? Because the Iranians want to wipe Saudi Arabia off the face of the earth, maybe not as much, but almost as much as they do Israel.
Well, maybe even more so,
Hmm.
because Mecca, they
Yes,
would like to control Mecca. So
correct. That's true.
it's look, Israel. The Israeli question is a stick to beat the Sunnis with. That is to say that they have not gotten the Israelis out of the holy city of Jerusalem. But Mecca counts a whole lot more than Jerusalem. So um, if you were running the Saudi government and the Americans were snuggling up to the Iranians, you might want to make a deal with the Iranians because they're a real threat to you. Uh,
Hmm.
if the Americans are hostile to Iran and are making real trouble for Iran, you might be willing to join an alliance with the other Gulf states and Israel against Iran. Keep in mind, Saudi Arabia is very rich and very weak. It doesn't have a very large population. It does not have much recent war fighting experience. Uh, it could be conquered.
Okay. So to
And
that point, I really want to hone in on that because here you brought up something earlier in our program, in our discussion, was that we end up propping up certain nations, maybe economically, maybe with weapons of war, and it ends up turning around and biting us in the end with Russia and of course with China and all these different elements that we propped up. Could the same thing happen with Saudi Arabia? We prop them up, we give them all sorts of weapons so they can fight back against this Iranian threat. Maybe that works in the short term, but long term, what does that look like?
Well, we've already experienced this. I mean, 9/11 was carried out by people with ties to the Saudi monarchy.
Hmm.
Maybe not to the government quite itself, but to members of the family, the descendants of Ibn Saud. And, if you're asking where did Islamism come from, this kind of Islamic revivalism and deep hostility, it was the expenditure of Saudi money to build mosques. It was the dispatch of Saudis as preachers in these mosques. So there has been a kind of holy war carried on by Saudi Arabia against the West for a very long time. It's receded to some degree because Saudi Arabia is now weaker than it was before, but it's there. We've paid a price for that, and look, when you deal with current issues, you often build up someone who is not friendly to you, but they're more hostile to your enemy than they are to you. For example, look at the history of Afghanistan. In the battle against the Russians in Afghanistan, we built up forces that came
Hmm.
back to bite us.
Yeah.
In the battle against Russia more generally, we made arrangements with China that came back to bite us. Uh, I'm afraid that's normal. And I think we did
Yes.
the right thing in Afghanistan when we did it. And I think we did the right thing in China under Richard Nixon.
Hmm.
But when Russia is no longer that important, I don't think you should keep up the thing.
Right.
You
There
should
should be
switch.
an end game here. And all of these, building up these other, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, but not forever. It's not a forever friend. Maybe at some point you cut off that relationship
No.
as well. Once you've used them to the point that you see as effective and necessary, and then cut off the relationship. And I think we fall into these traps for far too long. And I can see that with China, because when in 2020, when Donald Trump's his rhetoric against China was starting to really ramp up, there were so many people in this country that they didn't understand why he was so opposed to China. Aren't they a friend of ours? We have this, all this commerce
Yep.
going back and forth. We have, General Motors and Ford and Stellantis and Chrysler. They're all building these American companies there. We're working together. Aren't they an ally? In reality, no, they're not an ally. But we weren't fully aware of that because of how much we depend economically on China, this relationship, manufacturing and whatnot. So that's kind of where I think a lot of us were duped in a sense at how we've been so long befriending China, a communist nation with massive human rights abuses to their own people as well. But we kind of painted that and kind of glossed it over. And now we're seeing more and more who they really are. Will that continue? I guess the disillusionment of the American people as it relates to China under Donald Trump.
Well, Deng Xiaoping said to his fellow communist leaders, hide your strength, bide your time, never take the lead. Okay, that was a temporary policy. Take advantage of the Americans while they're being foolish. Be very cooperative with the Americans. Hide your strength for the time being. Bide your time. Don't take the lead. Xi Jinping comes in and they begin to take the lead because they think they're strong enough to win. And they are making a major attempt at winning. Uh, and it's an old fashioned continental policy, uh, control to attempt to control all of Eurasia through an alliance with Russia, in which Russia becomes dependent upon China. That's already pretty much happened.
Hmm.
And then through economic control over Europe. Uh, that's happening. One of the things I teach is ancient Greece, so I go to Greece fairly often. I don't know if you know this or your listeners or know this, but the Piraeus, the commercial port of Athens, of the commercial port of Greece, is under the control of the Chinese.
Hmm.
They
Yeah.
have a base in Haifa in Israel. They have an economic base in Trieste. Uh, the and their leverage economically in Central Asia and in Europe is tremendous.
Yeah. The
And
Belt
we've
and Road
allowed this to
Initiative.
happen.
Yeah, we did, and we allowed it to happen to us. But we see them doing China doing the same thing. The strategy in Africa and in South America, where all these nations end up becoming dependent economically on China, which gives China the leverage. And that's what my fear is in terms of this country, the United States. We have spent decades giving them the leverage over us economically, and it's very, very hard to decouple ourselves from them because they kind of control things. Manufacturing is just one aspect of it. But as we engage in the high tech industries, they kind of control the ingredients necessary for high tech. So
Yep.
it's we too far gone? Are we too engaged with China, or is it possible that we can effectively decouple ourselves from China and gain back that economic leverage?
I think we can. It requires a dedicated policy. You haven't had that under Biden. You may get it under Trump. I hope so. One of the figures, one of the very few figures who was a China skeptic from very early on was Donald Trump.
Hmm.
He saw it from the perspective of a businessman, and he realized that the Chinese were taking advantage of the eagerness of American CEOs for immediate profits because they profit from them themselves. Uh, uh, and they were sacrificing their corporations to China in the long run. You make a lot of money while you're running the company. You get stock, you sell the stock, and after you leave the company, it goes under because you've sold it, the whole thing out to China
Hmm.
through technology
Hmm.
transfer. Uh, he understood that because he understands business. I don't mean I'm an unabashed admirer of Trump. As I said, I think he was an ineffective president the first time around. But from the perspective, from where he sat, he could see certain things, and he saw it more clearly than anyone else.
Yeah.
So he's had some time to think since his first administration about how you run the government. I think his choice for Secretary of State Marco Rubio is a very good choice,
As do I.
and I think Marco Rubio has paid very close attention to these things. He will know things that Trump does not know, and having him as a major advisor, it's an excellent thing
Well, as you touched on
that he's
earlier, these
doing
are
in that
lessons learned
regard.
from Donald Trump's first term, and he's almost effectively had now a third term because he spent the last term really, and he never left the political scene. I mean, he's very much involved. Donald Trump is in determining who's the most effective, and who would be more loyal to him. He learned who he couldn't trust. In the government, and I think that was a very tough lesson for him as well. And as you said earlier, he's not a political insider in Washington D.C. You got to learn the ropes, the game, and how it's played. I do want to ask you two questions regarding Israel, then I'll let you go because you give me a lot of time here. But as it comes to the two-state solution, and I've often wondered this, but Donald Trump has pulled back from any plans to be any type of Palestinian state that he would support or the government of the United States would support. And I think, to me, from what I've read and people I've spoken to on both sides of the issue, Palestinians and Israelis, nobody really seems to really want a two-state solution. The Palestinians want the state to themselves, and Israel wants the state to themselves. And it comes down to, in my view, and you can correct me here where I'm wrong and fill in the blanks, but it comes down to the United States picking a side in this. So I guess my question is a two-state solution possible? And if not, how do we navigate through this very controversial issue?
If it was ever possible, that possibility was destroyed when Yasser Arafat rejected the deal that had been worked out at Camp David.
Yeah.
Um,
Right. Under
uh,
under Bill Clinton, correct?
yeah, I know a
Yeah.
Palestinian journalist who was present when he announced that he was not going to back it, and he explained in Arabic he didn't want to go the way of Sadat. He didn't
Mm.
want to be assassinated.
Yes.
It and immediately after that he launched the second Intifada. People have
Mm.
forgotten this, but the first Intifada was nonviolent. It was Gandhian, and it was directed by a Palestinian friend of mine named Sari Nasebi, who is the leading Palestinian Dove. And it was very successful in persuading Israelis that they really needed to do a deal with this population they were ruling order over their borders. Uh, and it opened up the possibility of negotiation and a settlement. And that settlement was eventually rejected. And then they launched a second intifada that was violent, involving suicide bombers.
Mm.
And we're in the middle of the third one now that started
Mm-hmm.
on October 7th,
Mm-hmm.
2023. Um, uh, there's not going to be a two-state solution. There are no Palestinians left who think that's possible. And the Israeli doves no longer think that's possible.
Okay.
Uh, it's simply not on. This is another bankrupt American policy. It goes back to 1947. Ever since 1947, we have attempted to be relatively even handed between the Israelis and the Palestinian refugees from 1947. It used to be the case that there was an American embassy uh, that was in Tel Aviv. And these are the people who dealt with our relations with Israel, and by and large, they were pro Israeli. And there was an American consulate in Jerusalem that was pro Palestinian. Uh, and we tried a balancing act from 1947 until the present day.
Yeah.
And it's been a failure.
Yeah. It
It's been
doesn't
an utter
work.
failure.
Yeah.
And you might ask, why haven't we admitted it's a failure and given up the whole thing? And the answer is there's a vast number of people in the foreign policy establishment who are invested in the policy. Just as in Britain in 1938, just about everybody was invested in the policy of appeasement. It took the German invasion of the rump of Czechoslovakia, Prague, to wake the British people up and the members of the British parties to the fact that the policy was bankrupt.
Hmm.
Uh, and we're in a somewhat similar position, which is our foreign policy establishment is not fully awake.
No, they're not. And
Which
you look at the UN and all these other global bodies, international entities, they seem to very much support not maybe a two-state solution, but even more so a Palestinian state, and Israel being gone from that whole equation altogether. But I do think that people are starting to wake up to a certain degree, especially when you look at all the violence that has been perpetrated by, you can say Palestinian supporters, even in this country on college campuses. But I want to ask you this final question as it relates to Israel. The Israelis, I think many of them would like to have control of the Temple Mount, which right now is not, it's under Islamic control. And that's the one area that the Israelis don't have. Do you think it's a possibility, as there are efforts, to one day reclaim control of the Temple Mount, right there smack dab in the middle of Jerusalem?
you know, for the Israelis to do that would make any kind of peace with the larger Arab world impossible. It's something that the Israeli governments, all of them, down to the present day, they know you don't touch that. Because, see, what you're talking about is tearing down the mosque and rebuilding the temple.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Right.
Uh,
Right.
there will be a religious war. It will stir up the Arab masses in a thoroughgoing way. None of the Arab governments will be able to control the situation.
Yeah. Do you see
Uh,
foresee maybe a scenario where, because there's been talk about this as it relates to the Abraham Accords, and you got the mosque there, and you have a temple, and then you have a Christian church? That's been discussed. I don't know if it's been bandied about, but I don't know if how realistic that would ever be.
I think it's something not to touch.
Yeah.
And a Christian church up there doesn't mean anything. I mean, the key Christian church is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, uh, and it is it's a complicated story. It's under Muslim control. The
Yeah.
family of my friend Sari Nasebi, they are the keeper of the keys of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre because of the bitter divide between Catholics, Orthodox Christians, and Monophysite Christians. So if you go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, there are areas controlled by the Catholics, areas controlled by the Orthodox, and areas controlled by the Monophysites of various sorts, the Armenians, the Copts, and so forth. And they guard those areas fiercely.
It's
And
amazing.
every morning, members of the three Christian bodies that I just mentioned meet with a representative of the keeper of the keys of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to open up the church.
Hmm. Isn't that
So it's
amazing?
in Muslim
Wow.
hands because the
Yeah.
Christians are so bitterly opposed to one another there'd be bloodshed. And
Yeah. There's
every
so
once in
much
a
to
while,
it.
there's a riot inside the church
That's
between.
amazing. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, so what I'm
Yeah.
getting at is religion's a serious, serious, serious matter. And
It
a
is.
lot of what's wrong with American foreign policy in that part of the world, especially with regard to Iran, is the State Department doesn't take religion seriously.
No, they don't. And it's deeply, deeply personal. Religion is. And to
Oh,
all these different people involved here, and they will defend it to the death. I mean, that's, you look at what Jesus taught his apostles.
yep.
Don't be afraid of man who can kill the body, but fear him who can kill body and soul in hell. There's that mindset that exists, and it's deeply personal. So to refute that is pretty tough. I want to thank you for your time. You give me so much of your time, and I can't thank you enough for it. Dr. Paul Rahe is a professor of history at Hillsdale College. Doctor, so good to see you. Thanks for all your insight, and I really, really appreciate it. Thank you.
I enjoyed this. Take care.
You too. Thank you so much. Hope to talk again. Pretty amazing. I am, one that obviously says that we need to have, as a country, unequivocal support for Israel. And to me, it's this the moral clarity in a region that has been plagued by chaos, and recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital by moving the U.S. embassy there was a courageous act by Donald Trump, and it was so opposed by so many quote unquote experts in that region. Even former presidents who said that, yeah, they still acknowledge presidents of the United States that Jerusalem is the capital, but to actually move the embassy there from Tel Aviv would cause so much chaos in the region that they wouldn't do it. Well, Donald Trump did it. And what kind of chaos erupted during that time? Not a whole lot. In fact, he just kind of planted the flag there, and it emboldened the Israelis there. Okay, they thought we truly have an ally in the United States. This is a huge move. Of course, I'm sure it upset the Palestinians in Gaza, and there's all sorts. When a strong leader was no longer in office in the United States, they took advantage of it by maybe that's one of the incentives to attacking the Israelis on October 7th, 2023, the horrific terrorist attack. And to me, it's just another reason why a two-state solution will never work out in that region, because they are so diametrically opposed to one another. The Islamic Palestinians and the Jewish Israelis, they're forever opposed to one another, and to live side by side like that it's unattainable. I mean, there's some nominal Jews and there's some nominal Muslims that maybe they can just interact and it's no problem. But when you talk about people who are really committed to the religion, and as I said earlier, it's deeply personal. They believe their eternity is at stake here, and in terms of how they believe, it's not possible. in my view. And I think more and more people are waking up to that fact. All right, a couple of headlines here. I want to talk about this, the tragedy that unfolded in New York, United Healthcare, the death there, the CEO. You can see this here. A horrific video. Just walking down the street about, 6:30 in the morning. So that tragedy, Midtown in Manhattan, has obviously sparked a firestorm online, raising serious questions about the erosion of respect for human life in our culture. United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson, he was shot and killed in what investigators say was a politically motivated attack. But to me now, a few days after this, it's this reaction online that is exposing a troubling trend from liberals. The way they look at this actual incident. So Brian Thompson, the shocking murder of this guy is really a disturbing reflection of our cultural decay. Right there in the morning in Midtown Manhattan. He's a father, he's the leader of this, the largest insurance company in the country, gunned down by this unknown person who they're still looking for, left behind some bullet casings, I guess, with words like deny or depose and defend etched into those bullet casings, basically a nod to the frustrations over health insurance. Hey, I got some frustrations with health insurance too, but I'm not going to go and kill the CEO. So police right now, here's this. So they're continuing to look for the guy, the suspect. But some far-left voices wasted no time, well-known far-left voices, mocking the tragedy. Former Washington Post journalist Taylor Lorenz, for example, here's what she posts online. And people wonder, here's what she said, people wonder why we want these executives dead. That's what Taylor Lorenz said. Like, she supports the killing of the CEO. I mean, this just goes beyond political frustrations. It's dangerous. It's normalization of the dehumanization that has been happening in our country. Even some traditional progressive voices like Aaron Rupar, he kind of slammed Taylor Lorenz on this. He says it's absolutely depraved for that. There's a conservative commentator, you probably know who he is, Joe Concha. He came out and said, this is what happens when you embrace a worldview that justifies violence against those you disagree with. And that has been, despite their claims that it's the reverse, it's been primarily from the left. And others are asking now how this movement, so-called compassion, progressivism, that preaches compassion, can celebrate violence. It's because they seem, some of them at least, seem to think it's okay to commit violence. We saw it in 2020, the violent riots around this country that killed many, many people, celebrated by many people on the left. All right, Don, let's go to the Joe Biden pardoning thing. He's weighing now these preemptive pardons. Have you heard about this, Joe Biden? A gamble with his far-reaching implications. If he does what we think he might do or what he is considering, it is setting a dangerous precedent. So Joe Biden, as he's considering, the final weeks in office here, and his approach to the pardons, there's a controversial debate that is brewing over potential preemptive pardons for high-profile critics of President-elect Donald Trump. And the discussions are being spearheaded by White House Chief of Staff Jeffrey Zients and Counsel Ed Siskel. They're talking about this at the highest levels in the White House. And sharp division among Democrats, and it's igniting a whole lot of speculation now about Joe Biden's motives. What is he going to do with these presidential pardon powers? So the possibility now, these blanket pardons for people like Dr. Anthony Fauci and, Senator-elect Adam Schiff, the congressman from California, who have committed what appear to be crimes, if what the accusations against them are true, very high levels of conspiracy, whatnot, Anthony Fauci and globalism and Adam Schiff working with these, maybe even the Russians to put together this whole Russia hoax, collusion hoax with Donald Trump and the false accusations against him. Were crimes committed with the FISA court? How involved was Adam Schiff with that? Well, now it's possibilities, at least it's being discussed, that guys like him, Adam Schiff and Dr. Fauci, could be given blanket pardons, total immunity from any future, accusations or charges against them. And critics are saying, listen, these actions could absolutely continue to undermine the justice system and set these dangerous precedents for political power and people elevating people above the law. Joe Biden, and it's all stemming from his recent pardon of his son, Hunter Biden, already that strong, a lot of sharp criticism for, echoing Donald Trump's claims of a weaponized justice system. But all bets are off now, and that's what one Democratic strategist has now said, just trying to protect people as he gets out of office. And then adding to that tension, Donald Trump's presumptive FBI director nominee, Kash Patel, openly threatening legal action against his detractors, fueling fears of retribution under the new administration. But the fact is, if they have truly committed crimes, not made up crimes, but truly have been doing this for so many years, it seems right to actually go after them from a criminal perspective. But again, who knows? Joe Biden might give them all presidential pardons, preemptive pardons before leaving office. All right. Thank you for joining us for this hour. I don't know if we have any comments or questions here. We'll get to them real fast. Let's get to them real quickly. We got a couple minutes here to get through this as we head into the weekend. Annie, hilarious China video Trump. Thanks for playing it. Yes, you're welcome, Annie. I liked it too, and that's why I played it. Cameron Harris liked it. We laughed about it yesterday when we were putting this together. So thank you for that, Annie. Let's bring up another one here. R. Paulus is back. American capitalism went to China to survive. Yeah, it did. And I spoke to somebody who used to be a huge executive in the auto industry back in, I think, 2014 timeframe. Barack Obama was still in office saying, listen, we are so entrenched in China right now. We have given away basically our economy and the free market system to that regime over there. I don't know if we can ever get out of it, but we need to try. And Donald Trump comes into office 2017, and he starts the whole process rolling here. And it's something that we need to take seriously. Yeah, R. Paulus, thanks so much. Appreciate it. And one more comment here. It's from Andy, very balanced view of Trump. Hopefully he has learned for the second term and will become even more effective. Andy, thank you for that. Appreciate it so much. And thank you for watching. Appreciate you. Have a fantastic weekend. We'll see you back here on Monday for another edition of Tom Jordan Live, 9 a.m. Eastern, streaming live on X, YouTube, and where else are we? Facebook. Yes. Thank you. And then, of course, we're on Spotify and Apple Podcasts as well. God bless you. Have a fantastic weekend. Take care.